There's a version of you that you have never met. It walks beside you through every corridor of your adult life. It speaks through your voice when you react before thinking. It reaches out with your hands when you pull away from intimacy. It beats within your chest when anxiety floods your body for reasons you cannot name. This version of you was born decades ago, in moments you may not even remember, and yet it has been authoring the story of your life ever since. Tonight, we descend into the archaeology of the self. We journey into the foundations upon which your identity was built, stone by stone, wound by wound, in the formative years when your mind was still soft clay in the hands of the world. This is not a journey of blame. It is not a descent into victimhood or a search for someone to hold accountable for your pain. Number. This is something far more profound and far more dangerous. This is an excavation of truth. Because the question that haunts every human being who has ever stopped long enough to truly look at themselves is this: who am I really? And more importantly, how much of who I am was chosen by me, and how much was chosen for me before I had the consciousness to choose at all? Imagine, for a moment, a child standing in a vast library. The shelves stretch endlessly in all directions, reaching towards ceilings lost in shadow. Each book on those shelves contains a story, a belief, a pattern, a way of being in the world. The child cannot read yet. The child does not understand the weight of the volumes that surround them. But adults move through this library with purpose, pulling books from shelves and placing them in the child's small arms. This is who you are, they say, handing over a heavy tome titled, "You Are Not Enough." This is how the world works, they explain, sliding another volume into the growing stack. Love must be earned through performance. This is what safety looks like, they whisper, adding a thin, worn book. Trust no one completely. The child's arms grow tired. The books are heavy, but the child holds them because the adults seem so certain, so authoritative, so convinced that these books contain essential truths. And so the child begins to read these books over and over, year after year, until the words on the pages become the voice in their head, until the stories in these books become the story they tell about themselves, until the child forgets that they are holding books at all. By the time that child becomes an adult, they believe these stories are simply reality. They don't see them as inherited narratives. They don't recognize them as the accumulated wounds of their early years, transformed into identity. They just think, this is who I am. This is how I am. This is how the world is. But what if I told you that everything you believe about yourself, everything you assume is fixed and permanent about your personality, your capacity for love, your worthiness of joy, your relationship to success and failure, was decided not by your genes or your soul or your destiny, but by a series of interpretations made by a child who did not have the cognitive sophistication to interpret accurately? What if the you that you think is your true self is actually a defensive structure built by a 5-year-old who was trying to survive? The ancient Greeks had a concept called anamnesis, the idea that learning is actually remembering. That knowledge is not acquired but recovered, drawn up from depths we didn't know existed within us. Plato believed we are born with truths written on our souls, truths that life's distractions cause us to forget. And that philosophy is the practice of remembering what we already know. But what if we've been remembering the wrong things? What if instead of remembering the eternal truths written on our souls, we've been remembering the traumas written on our nervous systems? What if we've been remembering the fear instead of the love, the wound instead of the wholeness, the survival strategy instead of the authentic self? Tonight, we practice a different kind of anamnesis. We remember not to retrieve, but to release. We remember not to reinforce, but to recognize. We remember so that we can finally, after all these years, forget. The Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This sentence contains within it the entire architecture of human transformation. It suggests that what we experience as destiny is often nothing more than the automated patterns running beneath our awareness. It suggests that freedom is not found in the external world, but in the internal act of bringing light to the darkness within. But here is what Jung did not fully articulate, what perhaps could not be articulated until neuroscience gave us new language. The unconscious that directs your life is not mystical. It is not a shadow realm populated by archetypes and ancestral memories, though those frameworks have their poetry and their uses. No, the unconscious that directs your life is a biological recording system, inscribed in your neural pathways during the years when your brain was developing most rapidly, when every experience was being catalogued as evidence about the nature of reality. Your childhood wounds are not metaphors. They are neural networks. They are synaptic patterns. They are the physical architecture of your brain, shaped by repeated emotional experiences before you had the capacity to question or resist those experiences. And here is the revelation that changes everything. If your identity was built, it can be rebuilt. If your patterns were learned, they can be unlearned. If your neural networks were shaped by experience, they can be reshaped by new experience. But first, you must see them. There is a phenomenon in psychology called scotoma, a blind spot in vision, but there is also a psychological scotoma, a blind spot in consciousness, where we cannot see the very patterns that most determine our behavior. We are like fish who cannot see the water they swim in, not because the water is invisible, but because it is so constant, so all-encompassing, that it has become synonymous with reality itself. Your childhood wounds have created scotomas in your consciousness. They have created zones of experience that you cannot see clearly, not because you are stupid or weak, but because seeing them clearly would have been too dangerous when you were young. Your psyche, in its brilliant attempt to protect you, made certain truths invisible. It relegated certain patterns to the unconscious so that you could keep functioning, keep surviving, keep moving forward. But survival is not the same as living, and the strategies that saved you as a child are now the very things that imprison you as an adult. This is the paradox at the heart of all psychological development. The defenses that protected you became the walls that trapped you. The adaptations that helped you survive became the patterns that prevent you from thriving. The identity you constructed to earn love, avoid pain, and maintain safety is now the primary source of your suffering. Who you became in order to survive is standing between you and the life you actually want to live. So tonight, we ask the question that began this journey. Who am I really? But we ask it with new sophistication. We ask it knowing that the answer is not simple. We ask it knowing that beneath the person you present to the world, beneath even the person you present to yourself in private moments, there are layers, archaeological strata of self, each layer bearing the marks of the time in which it was formed. There is the authentic self you were born as, the original blueprint, the seed of your unique consciousness, present in the first days of your life, before the world began its relentless education. Then there is the adapted self, constructed in early childhood in response to the emotional environment you found yourself in. This is the self that learned what was safe and what was dangerous, what earned approval and what brought rejection, what kept connection and what risked abandonment. And then there is the performed self, the mask you wear in adult life, the persona you have refined and perfected, often without realizing you are performing at all. This is the self that goes to work, navigates relationships, presents itself on social media, and tells stories at dinner parties. But here is what most people never discover. The performed self is not performing for the outside world, Not really. The performed self is performing for the adapted self, trying desperately to keep that wounded child safe by meeting the conditions it believes are necessary for survival and love. You are not living your life. You are living the life that a traumatized child decided was necessary. And that child, frozen in time within your unconscious, is still making your decisions, still choosing your relationships, still sabotaging your success, still pulling you back every time you get close to something that threatens its sense of what is safe, until you meet that child, until you see the wounds that child carries, until you understand the primitive logic by which that child makes sense of the world. You will continue to call your patterns personality and your limitations reality. But once you see them, everything becomes possible. Welcome, traveler, to the first stirring of awakening. Welcome to the moment when the ghost in the mirror finally becomes visible. Welcome to the archaeology of the self. The journey begins now. Act 1. The origins, the architecture of the unformed self. Let us begin at the beginning, though the beginning is more mysterious than we often acknowledge. You arrived in this world as pure potential. Not a blank slate, as the empiricist philosophers once claimed, but not a finished book either. More accurate to say, you arrived as a tendency, a leaning, a collection of predispositions and possibilities. The ancient question of nature versus nurture presents a false dichotomy. You were both. You were a seed containing certain instructions, certain probabilities, planted in the soil of your particular family, culture, and moment in history. But here is what matters. In those first years, you were radically undefended, radically open, radically dependent. The human infant is born more helpless than almost any other creature on earth. While other animals can walk within hours or days of birth, the human child requires years of complete dependence on caregivers for survival. This is not an evolutionary accident. This is the price we pay for our remarkable brains. We are born with skulls that can barely fit through the birth canal, with brains that are only 25% of their adult size, specifically so that most of our neural development can occur outside the womb, shaped by experience rather than purely by genetics. In other words, we are born unfinished, and the world finishes us. Neuroscientist Bruce Perry describes the infant brain as experience expectant. It arrives in the world expecting certain types of experiences, touch, voice, eye contact, emotional attunement, and it uses these experiences as instructions for how to wire itself. The brain of the young child is building itself in real time, forming connections at the staggering rate of more than 1 million neural connections per second in the first years of life. Every interaction, every emotional tone, every moment of comfort or distress is not just an event happening to the child. It is a construction event happening in the child. The architecture is being built. And here is the crucial insight. The infant brain does not distinguish between objective reality and subjective experience. It does not have the cognitive capacity to say, "My mother is stressed because of external circumstances that have nothing to do with me." The infant brain only registers, "Distress is present, danger is near, I'm not safe." The child does not interpret. The child encodes. And what gets encoded in those early years becomes the operating system for everything that follows. Let me take you back. Not to your own childhood yet. We will arrive there soon enough. But back further to the early 20th century, to Vienna, where a strange and revolutionary thinker named Sigmund Freud was beginning to articulate ideas that would forever change how we understand the human mind. Freud was not the first to notice that adults carry their childhoods within them. Poets and mystics had been saying this for millennia. But Freud was the first to systematize it, to create a model, to suggest that the wounds of childhood did not simply create sad memories, but actually structured the personality itself. He called his method psychoanalysis, the analysis of the psyche, and his central claim was radical for its time. The adult neurotic is not suffering from the present. They are suffering from the past, specifically from a past they cannot consciously remember, but which continues to exert enormous influence over their emotional life. Freud observed his patients, mostly middle-class Viennese women, suffering from what was then called hysteria, and noticed patterns. They had physical symptoms with no physical cause. They had intense emotional reactions seemingly out of proportion to present circumstances. They had repetitive, self-destructive behaviors that they claimed to want to stop but could not. And when he listened carefully, when he allowed them to speak freely without censoring themselves, when he analyzed their dreams and their slips of the tongue, he found that their symptoms were not random. They were symbolic. They were the present-day manifestation of conflicts originating in early childhood, conflicts that had been repressed because they were too painful or too threatening for the conscious mind to handle. Freud was seeing, for the first time with clinical clarity, what we now call the unconscious, not as a mystical realm, but as a psychological structure, a repository of everything we have experienced but cannot bear to remember, a vault of feelings, impulses, and memories that continue to motivate us from beneath the surface of awareness. His patients, he realized, were not hysterical. They were haunted. But haunted not by external ghosts, haunted by internal ones, haunted by the child they used to be, by the feelings that child had but could not process, by the needs that child had but could not express, by the traumas that child endured but could not escape. One of Freud's most important contributions was his recognition of what he called defense mechanisms, the psychological strategies the ego employs to protect itself from anxiety, pain, and intolerable realities. Think of these as the moves the psyche makes to survive overwhelming experience. Repression, pushing painful memories and feelings completely out of conscious awareness, as if they never happened. Denial, refusing to acknowledge a painful reality even when evidence is overwhelming. Projection, taking feelings or qualities we cannot accept in ourselves and attributing them to others. Displacement, redirecting emotions from their original source to a safer target. The man who is angry at his boss but cannot express it, so he goes home and yells at his wife. Rationalization, creating logical-sounding explanations for behavior that is actually motivated by unconscious emotional needs. Sublimation, channeling unacceptable impulses into socially acceptable activities, sexual energy becoming artistic creativity, aggression becoming competitive success. These mechanisms are not character flaws. They are survival strategies. They are what the psyche does when it cannot fully process what is happening, when the truth is too dangerous, too painful, too overwhelming for the developing self to integrate. But here is what Freud understood. These defense mechanisms do not actually make the painful reality go away. They just make it invisible. The feelings still exist. The needs still exist. The wounds still exist. But now they operate in the dark, shaping behavior in ways the person cannot understand or control. The defended self is not a safe self. It is an unconscious self. And the unconscious self is a tyrannical self, repeating the same patterns compulsively, seeking resolution for conflicts it cannot name, trying to master traumas it cannot remember. Freud called this repetition compulsion, the tendency to unconsciously recreate the conditions of our original trauma over and over, in an unconscious attempt to finally gain mastery over it. The woman whose father was emotionally unavailable finds herself repeatedly attracted to emotionally unavailable men. The man who was criticized constantly as a child becomes either a perfectionist who can never rest, or a self-saboteur who proves his inner critic right by failing. We do not simply remember our wounds, we reenact them. But Freud, brilliant as he was, missed something crucial. Or rather, he saw it but could not fully articulate it. He remained focused on intrapsychic conflict, the war within the individual mind between id, ego, and superego. He saw the child primarily as a being struggling with internal drives and the harsh requirements of civilization. What he did not fully grasp was the relational dimension, the understanding that the child's development is not just a matter of managing impulses, but of forming attachment, of learning to exist in emotional connection with others. This is where another voice enters our story, a voice that would transform our understanding of childhood wounds. John Bowlby. Bowlby was a British psychologist and psychiatrist who, in the middle of the 20th century, began to study something that seemed almost too obvious to require study: the bond between mother and child. He observed children who had been separated from their mothers, orphans, hospitalized children, evacuees during World War II. And he noticed something devastating. These children did not simply miss their mothers. They went through a predictable sequence of responses. First protest, crying and searching for the lost caregiver, then despair, a collapse into grief and withdrawal, and finally detachment, a kind of emotional shutdown where the child seemed to stop caring at all. Bowlby realized he was watching something profound, the formation of an internal working model of relationships. These children were learning, at the most fundamental level, whether other people could be trusted, whether their needs would be met, whether the world was a safe or dangerous place. He called this attachment theory, and it would become one of the most important frameworks in all of psychology for understanding how childhood experiences shape adult identity. Bowlby's student Mary Ainsworth would later design an elegant experiment called the strange situation to test different attachment styles in young children. She would briefly separate infants from their mothers in an unfamiliar room, then observe what happened when the mothers returned. What she found was remarkable. Children did not all respond the same way. Some children, about 65%, showed what she called secure attachment. They became distressed when their mother left, but they were easily comforted when she returned. They used her as a safe base from which to explore the world. But the other 35% showed patterns that would prove hauntingly predictive of adult dysfunction. Some children showed anxious, ambivalent attachment. They were extremely distressed when the mother left, but when she returned, they could not be comforted. They both sought contact and resisted it, angry and clingy at the same time. Other children showed avoidant attachment. They seemed indifferent when the mother left and indifferent when she returned. They had learned, already, not to expect their needs to be met. They had shut down their attachment system to protect themselves from disappointment. And a final group, identified later by Mary Main, showed disorganized attachment, a chaotic mixture of contradictory behaviors, reflecting children who experienced their caregiver as both their source of safety and their source of danger. Children caught in an impossible bind. I need you, but you hurt me. These patterns, formed in the first 18 months of life, do not disappear as we grow older. They become the template for all future relationships. The securely attached infant becomes the adult who can form healthy, intimate bonds, who can ask for help when needed, who can tolerate both closeness and independence, who trusts that others will be there but does not cling desperately or push away defensively. The anxiously attached infant becomes the adult who is hypervigilant in relationships, constantly scanning for signs of rejection or abandonment, needing constant reassurance, often overwhelming partners with their neediness while simultaneously doubting any reassurance they receive. The avoidantly attached infant becomes the adult who privileges independence above all, who feels uncomfortable with too much intimacy, who leaves before being left, who mistakes isolation for strength and vulnerability for weakness. And the disorganizedly attached infant becomes the adult caught in the most painful contradiction, desperate for connection but terrified of it, drawing people close then pushing them away, creating chaos in relationships as an unconscious reenactment of their earliest experiences of love as dangerous. Can you see it now? Can you see how the child's first relationships become the prototype for all relationships that follow? How what you learned about love before you could speak becomes the silent script you follow in adult intimacy? Your attachment style is not your personality. It is your wound pretending to be your personality. But there is more. Because attachment theory, revolutionary as it was, still focused primarily on one relationship, mother and child. What about the father? What about siblings? What about the broader family system, the culture, the 1,000 other forces that shape the developing self? This is where a third voice enters. The voice of family systems theory, pioneered by therapists like Murray Bowen and Virginia Satter. They recognize that the child does not develop in a vacuum, not even in a simple dyad with mother. The child develops within a complex emotional field, a web of relationships, spoken and unspoken rules, intergenerational patterns, and family myths. Bowen introduced the concept of differentiation, the ability to remain yourself while staying in emotional contact with others. To have a clear sense of your own thoughts, feelings, and values without being overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of those around you. In poorly differentiated families, there is what Bowen called emotional fusion, a blurring of boundaries where one person's anxiety immediately becomes everyone's anxiety, where individuality is experienced as betrayal, where love and enmeshment become confused. Children growing up in such systems learn that to be themselves is to be alone. They learn that maintaining connection requires abandoning authenticity. So they develop what psychologist Donald Winnicott called a false self, a carefully constructed persona designed to meet others' needs and expectations, while the true self goes into hiding, sometimes so deep into hiding that the person forgets it exists at all. Winnicott understood something profound. The false self is not created out of malice or manipulation. It is created out of adaptation to an environment that cannot see, accept, or nurture the true self. The child learns, I am not acceptable as I am. I must become what they need me to be in order to survive, and so the wound is formed. Not necessarily from abuse or neglect in the obvious sense. Sometimes the wound is formed in families that look perfectly functional from the outside. Families where the parents mean well but are too anxious, too controlling, too enmeshed, too distant, too preoccupied with their own unresolved trauma to truly see the child as a separate being with their own inner life. The wound is formed whenever the message is communicated, subtly or overtly. Your authentic self is not welcome here. Let us go deeper still. Because there is a fourth dimension to all of this, a dimension that earlier psychologists could not see clearly because they did not have the tools, the dimension of neurobiology. We now know, thanks to decades of research in neuroscience and developmental psychology, that trauma and chronic stress in childhood do not just create psychological patterns, they create biological patterns. They alter the structure and function of the developing brain. When a child experiences chronic stress, whether from abuse, neglect, chaotic family environments, or even well-meaning but emotionally unavailable parents, their stress response system becomes dysregulated. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which regulates our response to threat, gets stuck in a state of hyperactivation. The amygdala, the brain's alarm system, becomes enlarged and overreactive. The hippocampus, crucial for memory and emotional regulation, may actually shrink. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function and emotional regulation, develops more slowly or with less integration with emotional centers. What does this mean in practical terms? It means that the child of trauma grows into an adult who experiences the world as more dangerous than it actually is. Their alarm system goes off more easily, more intensely, and takes longer to reset. They have difficulty distinguishing between past and present threats. Their body reacts to a critical comment from a boss as if it were a physical attack. Their nervous system responds to vulnerability in a relationship as if it were life-threatening. This is not weakness. This is not irrationality. This is neurobiology. This is a nervous system shaped by early experiences to be constantly vigilant, constantly prepared for the worst, because in the world of that child's early experience, vigilance was necessary for survival. Bessel van der Kolk, one of the world's leading trauma researchers, says it simply: the body keeps the score. Trauma is not just remembered by the mind, it is remembered by the body. It is encoded in the nervous system, in muscle tension, in patterns of breathing and movement, in the ways we hold ourselves and react to the world. The wounded child does not just live in your memories. The wounded child lives in your cells. And here is where all of these threads come together into a single, stunning realization. Your identity, the way you see yourself, the way you relate to others, the emotional patterns that seem so fixed and inevitable, is not a discovery of who you truly are. It is a construction built from the materials of your early experience. Freud showed us the unconscious, how the mind defends itself by hiding what it cannot process. Bowlby showed us attachment, how our first relationships create the template for all relationships. Family systems theory showed us the field, how we develop not in isolation, but within complex emotional networks. And neuroscience showed us the biology, how experience literally shapes the structure of the brain. Together, these perspectives reveal a truth both terrifying and liberating. You are not born as a fixed self. You become a self in response to the conditions of your early life, and the self you became is not necessarily the self you were meant to be. The person you think of as you, your personality, your patterns, your automatic reactions, is actually a survival strategy crystallized into identity. It is the answer to the question, what did I need to become in order to survive in my particular family, in my particular circumstances, in my particular moment? And the tragedy is that we rarely outgrow these strategies. We carry them forward into adult life, where they are often no longer necessary, where they may in fact be the primary source of our suffering, but where they feel so fundamental to who we are that we cannot imagine living without them. The wound becomes the identity, and the identity becomes the prison. But if you can see this, truly see it, not just intellectually, but viscerally, emotionally, in your bones, then something becomes possible that was not possible before. You can begin to choose differently. You can begin to ask, what would I be like if I were not defending against a danger that no longer exists? Who would I be if I were not performing for a parent who lives now only in my unconscious? How would I love if I were not still trying to solve the attachment puzzle from 40 years ago? The answers to these questions are not found in thinking. They are found in dissent. Act 2. The conflict. The descent into the shadow. We have traced the origins. We have seen how the architecture is built. Now we must descend into the structure itself, into the chambers and corridors where the wounded child still lives, still governs, still makes decisions from the darkness. This is the most dangerous part of the journey, because to see your wounds clearly is to lose the comfort of your illusions. To recognize your patterns is to surrender the story you have been telling yourself about who you are and why your life looks the way it does. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "If you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." This is not a warning. This is an invitation. Because only by gazing into the abyss of your unconscious, only by facing what you have been running from, can you finally become whole. Carl Jung called this the shadow, all the parts of ourselves we have disowned, rejected, or repressed because they did not fit the image we needed to present to survive. The shadow is not evil, though it may contain rage, desire, vulnerability, need, all the things we learned were unacceptable. The shadow is simply what is, separated from consciousness by the necessity of defense. And here is Jung's great insight. We cannot become whole by transcending the shadow. We can only become whole by integrating it, by bringing what was unconscious into consciousness, by meeting the disowned parts of ourselves with compassion and curiosity rather than judgment and fear. But to do this requires facing things we have spent a lifetime avoiding. Let me tell you about the core wounds, the fundamental injuries that shape human identity. Psychologists have attempted to categorize these in various ways. Psychiatrist Jeffrey Young identified what he called early maladaptive schemas, 18 core patterns formed in childhood that create lifelong themes of dysfunction. Others have different frameworks. But beneath the various systems, certain wounds appear again and again, certain deprivations that the child experiences and then spends a lifetime trying to unconsciously resolve. The wound of abandonment, the experience, literal or emotional, of being left, the child whose parent dies, whose parents divorce, whose mother suffers from depression and becomes emotionally unreachable, whose father works constantly and is never present. The child who learns that people leave, that connection cannot be trusted, that to need is to inevitably be disappointed. This child becomes the adult who either clings desperately to relationships out of terror of being left, or who preemptively abandons others before they can be abandoned, or who avoids deep connection entirely because they have unconsciously decided that to be alone is safer than to risk loss again. The wound of rejection, the experience of being fundamentally unseen, unvalued, or unwanted. The child whose parent was critical, dismissive, or simply too preoccupied to notice them. The child who internalized the message, "You are not enough. You are not worthy of attention, love, celebration." This child becomes the adult who is constantly performing, constantly seeking validation, constantly trying to prove their worth through achievement, appearance, or people-pleasing. They seek external evidence of value because they have no internal sense of it, and no amount of external success ever fills the void, because the void was created by a child who needed to be loved for who they were, not for what they did. The wound of enmeshment, the experience of not being allowed to be separate. The child whose parent used them to meet their own emotional needs, who blurred boundaries, who made the child responsible for the parent's happiness, who became anxious or punitive when the child showed independence. This child learns that to have a self is to be selfish, that love requires self-abandonment, that saying no risks catastrophic loss of connection. This child becomes the adult who cannot set boundaries, who feels guilty for having their own needs and desires, who stays in relationships long past the point of toxicity, because leaving feels like murder. The wound of mistrust, the experience of safety being unpredictable or violated. The child who was abused, whose parent was rageful or volatile, whose home was chaotic, who learned that the world is dangerous and people cannot be trusted. This child becomes the adult with hypervigilance, with control issues, with an inability to relax or be vulnerable. They are always scanning for threat, always prepared for betrayal, always maintaining escape routes. They may become controlling, using manipulation or aggression to create a sense of safety, or they may become submissive, constantly appeasing others to avoid triggering danger. Either way, they are not living in the present. They are living in a past where the world was genuinely unsafe, and they cannot yet distinguish that past from now. The wound of shame, the experience of being fundamentally flawed or defective. This is perhaps the most insidious wound, because it is not about what the child did, but about what the child is. Shame is the belief that I am bad rather than I did something bad. This wound is often created in families with addiction, mental illness, or abuse, where the child internalizes the family dysfunction as evidence of their own wrongness. It is reinforced by messages that the child's natural impulses, anger, sexuality, need, exuberance, are disgusting or dangerous. This child becomes the adult who hides, who sabotages success because success makes them too visible, who may develop addiction or self-harm as ways of either numbing the pain or confirming their sense of unworthiness. Shame is the conviction that if anyone truly knew you, they would be repulsed, so you ensure that no one ever truly knows you. These wounds do not exist in isolation. Most people carry some combination of them, a unique fingerprint of early experience that becomes the filter through which all of adult life is perceived and interpreted. And here is the diabolical brilliance of the psyche. It does not just carry these wounds as painful memories. It transforms them into identity. This is what we must understand if we are to ever break free. Your personality is largely an elaborate defense against your wounds. Let me say that again, because it is crucial. The person you think you are is mostly a defensive structure built to protect you from re-experiencing your core wounds. If your wound is abandonment, you may have developed a personality centered on independence. You pride yourself on not needing anyone. You are the strong one, the self-sufficient one, the one others lean on, but who never leans back. This feels like strength, like who you really are, but it is not. It is a defense. It is the child who decided that the only way to never be abandoned again is to never need anyone in the first place. Or perhaps you went the opposite direction. Your personality is organized around charm, agreeableness, making yourself indispensable. You are so helpful, so accommodating, so attuned to others' needs that surely no one would ever leave you. But beneath this generous persona is not actually generosity. It is a frantic, unconscious strategy to prevent the wound from reopening. If your wound is rejection, you may have become a perfectionist, driven, accomplished, successful by all external measures. But you cannot rest. You cannot celebrate your achievements because they never feel like enough. Each success is immediately followed by the question, what's next? You are not driven by passion or purpose. You are driven by an unconscious attempt to finally prove that you are worthy of love and acceptance. Or perhaps you went another direction entirely. You rejected the whole game. You cultivated an identity of not caring what others think, of being an outsider, a rebel, someone who scorns conventional success. But this too is not freedom. It is a different defense against the same wound, preemptively rejecting others before they can reject you, finding dignity in marginalization, because being chosen by the mainstream was never an option anyway. Do you see how this works? Do you see how sophisticated the psyche is in its defensive maneuvers? Your personality traits, your values, your entire sense of who you are is constructed largely in response to what you needed to become to survive your particular childhood. And because you have been performing this identity for so long, because it has been reinforced by thousands of interactions and decisions over decades, it feels fundamental. It feels like just who you are. But it is not who you are. It is who you became. And beneath that constructed identity, the authentic self still waits, silent, patient, hoping to one day be discovered. Let us go deeper still, into the mechanism by which childhood wounds become adult patterns, into what psychologists call the repetition compulsion, the unconscious tendency to recreate the conditions of our original trauma. Freud first noticed this phenomenon in his patients and was puzzled by it. Why would someone unconsciously seek out the very experiences that cause them pain? It seemed to violate the pleasure principle, the idea that humans are motivated to seek pleasure and avoid pain. But Freud realized something more subtle. The repetition compulsion is not about seeking pain. It is about seeking mastery. The unconscious is trying to recreate the original traumatic situation in the hope that this time the outcome will be different. This time, the unavailable parent will finally see them. This time, they will be good enough. This time they will earn the love that was withheld. Of course, it never works, because you are not actually dealing with your original parent. You are dealing with people in the present who happen to resemble, in some symbolic way, the original wound. The emotionally unavailable partner is not your father, though your unconscious treats them as if they are. And even if you could somehow get this person to love you, it would not heal the original wound. It would just be a different person loving you in the present. The child from the past would remain unhealed. This is the tragedy of the repetition compulsion. We keep playing the same game over and over, hoping for a different outcome, never realizing that the game itself is the problem. The woman who grew up with an alcoholic father finds herself repeatedly in relationships with addicted or emotionally unavailable men. Consciously, she hates this pattern. She vows that the next relationship will be different. But unconsciously, she is drawn to this dynamic because it is familiar, because somewhere deep in her psyche she believes that if she can just love this person enough, be perfect enough, then finally she will win. Finally she will get the love she needed as a child. The man whose mother was critical and controlling finds himself attracted to women who nitpick and dominate. Or perhaps he goes in the opposite direction, choosing women who are passive and submissive, but then he finds himself becoming the critical, controlling partner, identifying with the aggressor, as psychologists call it, taking on the role of the parent rather than remaining in the role of the wounded child. Either way, the pattern repeats, because the unconscious is literal. It does not understand metaphor. It does not understand that the best way to heal the past is not to recreate it, but to mourn it, feel it, and finally let it go. But there is another dimension to this that is even more subtle and perhaps more painful to acknowledge. We do not just unconsciously recreate our wounds in our relationships with others. We actively create them through our own behavior. This is what Gestalt therapist Fritz Perls meant when he said, "You are not trapped in situations. You are trapped in your own mind creating the situations. Your core wounds create what we might call self-fulfilling prophecies. The beliefs you formed as a child about yourself, others, and the world become the lens through which you perceive reality, and that lens actually shapes what you experience. If your wound is abandonment and you carry an unconscious belief that people always leave, you will likely behave in ways that make people want to leave. You might be clingy and anxious, overwhelming partners with your need for reassurance until they finally pull away, confirming your original belief. Or you might be preemptively distant and rejecting, pushing people away before they can leave you, which also confirms your belief that you end up alone. If your wound is rejection and you carry an unconscious belief that you are not enough, you will filter all interactions through this lens. When someone gives you a compliment, you will dismiss it or assume they are just being polite. When someone criticizes you, you will take it as confirmation of your unworthiness. You will focus on the one person at the party who seemed unimpressed by you and ignore the 10 people who genuinely enjoyed your company. Your attention will be constantly drawn to evidence that supports your core belief, and you will be blind to evidence that contradicts it. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, the tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information in a way that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. And when the pre-existing belief is a core wound from childhood, this bias becomes extraordinarily powerful. You do not see reality as it is. You see reality as you are. The world is not rejecting you. You are experiencing the world through the filter of a childhood wound that tells you that you will be rejected. And because you expect rejection, you interpret ambiguous situations as rejection. You behave in ways that invite rejection, and you remember the instances of rejection while forgetting the instances of acceptance. The wound creates the identity. The identity creates the behavior. The behavior creates the experience. and the experience confirms the wound. This is the loop. This is the prison. This is the cycle that continues, generation after generation, unless someone becomes conscious enough to see it and brave enough to break it. Let me tell you about the inner critic, because this is perhaps the most direct way that childhood wounds become adult identity. The inner critic is the voice in your head that tells you you are not enough, that you are failing, that you should be doing more, being more, achieving more, that you are lazy, stupid, selfish, weak, ugly, unlovable. Most people assume this voice is their own. They think, these are my thoughts. This is what I think about myself. But this is not your voice. This is the voice of your early environment, internalized. This is your parents' criticism, your siblings' teasing, your teachers' impatience, your culture's expectations, all of it absorbed by your young psyche and now playing on repeat in your own internal dialogue. Psychoanalysts call this the superego, the part of the psyche that enforces rules and punishes transgressions. But the superego is not some abstract moral faculty. It is a recording of the actual voices and messages you received in childhood, now experienced as if they were your own judgment. The child who is constantly criticized for making mistakes becomes the adult who cannot try anything new because the inner critic immediately attacks any imperfection. The child who was shamed for being emotional becomes the adult who judges themselves harshly for having feelings, who sees vulnerability as weakness. The child who was praised only for achievement becomes the adult who feels worthless if they are not constantly producing, constantly succeeding. And here is the cruelest part. The inner critic presents itself as helpful. It tells you it is just trying to motivate you, to keep you safe, to make you better. It says, if I did not criticize you, you would become lazy, arrogant, complacent. You would fail and people would reject you. But this is a lie, or at best, a tragic misunderstanding. The inner critic does not make you better. It makes you smaller. It does not motivate you toward growth. It motivates you toward defensive protection. It keeps you in the very patterns it claims to be, helping you overcome. Because when you are constantly under attack from within, you cannot rest, cannot celebrate, cannot take risks, cannot be creative, cannot be authentically yourself. You are always in survival mode, always defending, always trying to prove your worth to a judge who will never be satisfied. The inner critic is the voice of the wound, masquerading as wisdom. And until you recognize it as such, until you can distinguish between the critic's voice and your authentic self's voice, you will continue to unconsciously abuse yourself in the same way you were abused as a child. The wound becomes the identity by becoming the voice in your head, and so we arrive at the heart of the conflict, the core of the dissent. You have been living someone else's story, thinking it was your own. You have been operating from a set of unconscious beliefs about yourself, others, and the world that were formed by a child who did not have accurate information, who did not have the cognitive sophistication to interpret experience accurately, who made the best sense they could out of circumstances that were often confusing, painful, and overwhelming. And those beliefs. I'm not enough. People leave, the world is unsafe, I am too much, I must be perfect to be loved, my needs are a burden, showing weakness is dangerous, have been running your life ever since. They have been choosing your relationships, they have been limiting your career, they have been sabotaging your happiness, they have been whispering in your ear every time you get close to something you truly want. Who do you think you are? You will fail, you will be rejected, you will be abandoned, you will be hurt. And you have been listening, not because you are weak or stupid or broken, but because these voices sound like truth. They sound like reality. They sound like just the way things are. But they are not reality. They are the residue of trauma. They are the defensive structures of a child who had to make sense of an incomprehensible situation and did so in the only way available to them. That child was brilliant. That child was creative. That child survived circumstances that might have destroyed a less resilient spirit, but that child is not equipped to run your adult life. And yet that is exactly what is happening. Until you descend, until you meet that child, until you see the wounds clearly, feel them fully, and finally bring to them what they needed in the first place but did not receive. Witness, compassion, permission to exist, permission to feel, permission to need, permission to rest. This is the work. This is the descent. This is the conflict that must be faced if you are ever to be free, not to transcend the wound, not to overcome it, not to think your way out of it, but to turn toward it, to see it, to hold it, to let the adult you are now meet the child you were then, and to offer that child what no one else could offer when the wound was being formed. I see you, I believe you. It was not your fault. You did nothing wrong. You are worthy of love exactly as you are. This is the moment of descent. This is the dark night. This is the confrontation with everything you have been running from. And on the other side of this confrontation, if you can stay with it, if you can resist the urge to flee back into defense and distraction, something extraordinary becomes possible. Rebirth. Act 3. The awakening. The revelation of the authentic self. Let us speak now of resurrection, of what becomes possible when the defended self finally relaxes its grip, when the false identity, maintained at such tremendous cost for so many years, is finally seen for what it is, not who you are, but what you created to survive. There is a story told in many wisdom traditions, appearing in Buddhism, in Christian mysticism, in Sufism, in Jungian psychology, the story of the second birth. The idea that we are born twice, once into physical form and once into consciousness. The first birth happens to us. The second birth is something we must choose, must participate in, must labor to bring forth. The Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage. Perhaps everything that frightens us is, in its deepest essence, something helpless that wants our love. This is the revelation at the heart of all depth psychology, all authentic spiritual practice, all genuine transformation. What you have been running from is what holds your liberation. The wound you have been defending against is the doorway to your authentic self. Let me tell you what happens when you finally stop running, when you turn toward the wound instead of away from it, when you bring consciousness to what has been unconscious, light to what has been in shadow, compassion to what has been judged and exiled. The first thing that happens is grief, deep, soul-shaking grief for the child you were who did not receive what they needed, grief for the years spent in defensive patterns, grief for the relationships damaged or lost because you could not show up as your authentic self, grief for all the ways you have betrayed yourself to maintain safety, to keep connection, to avoid the pain of the original wound. This grief is not depression, it is not pathology, it is the appropriate human response to loss, and you have lost something, the illusion that you did not need anything, that you were fine, that your childhood was not that bad, that your defenses were your personality. In therapy, this is sometimes called the therapeutic crisis, the moment when the person's defensive structures begin to dissolve, and they are temporarily in a state of greater vulnerability than they were before. It feels like falling apart. It feels like regression, like going backward. But this is not falling apart. This is falling together. This is the defended self loosening so that the authentic self can emerge, and it requires grief to do this, because grief is the emotion that allows us to let go of what is no longer serving us. Grief is the passage between who you have been and who you are becoming. The second thing that happens is rage. For many people, especially those whose wounds involved suppressing their own needs and feelings to accommodate others, this emergence of rage can be terrifying, because their identity has been built on being nice, being accommodating, being easy to get along with. But beneath that niceness is often a volcano of unexpressed anger. Anger at the parent who was not capable of truly seeing them. Anger at the systems and structures that prioritized compliance over authenticity. Anger at themselves for colluding in their own diminishment, for saying yes when they meant no, for smiling when they wanted to scream. This anger is not pathology either. It is life force. It is the part of you that knows you are worthy of more than you have been accepting. It is the boundary-setting energy that was suppressed because setting boundaries felt too dangerous as a child. Many spiritual traditions teach that anger is something to be transcended, overcome, dissolved through equanimity and compassion. And there is truth in this for those who are stuck in reactive anger, perpetually blaming others for their circumstances. But for those who have spent a lifetime suppressing their anger, who have swallowed their rage to keep peace or maintain relationships, the work is not to transcend anger, but to finally feel it, to let it move through the body, to let it reveal what matters to you, what your limits are, where your boundaries need to be. Your anger, when it is felt consciously rather than acted out unconsciously, is information. It is telling you that something is not okay, that someone has violated your boundaries or your values, that you have been betraying yourself and some part of you is finally refusing to continue the betrayal. Let it speak, not in violence or cruelty, but in truth. Let yourself know what is not okay. This is the beginning of self-respect. The third thing that happens, after the grief and the rage have been honored, is the most remarkable. You begin to meet yourself. Not the defended self, not the false self, not the identity you constructed to survive, but the you who was always there underneath, waiting patiently for the defenses to relax enough that you could emerge. This authentic self is not something you have to create or achieve or become. It is not waiting at the end of some journey of self-improvement. It is already here. It has always been here. It was just obscured by the defensive structures you needed to survive. Donald Winnicott, the British psychoanalyst, distinguished between the false self and the true self. The false self, as we discussed, is the adaptive facade we present to meet others' expectations and keep ourselves safe. It is not entirely fake. It is a real part of our psyche, serving a real protective function. But it is not the totality of who we are. The true self, by contrast, is your spontaneous, authentic experiencing of being alive. It is the part of you that feels what it feels, wants what it wants, knows what it knows, without filtering through the question, is this acceptable? Will this be approved? Is this safe? The true self is not concerned with being appropriate. It is concerned with being real. And here is the extraordinary thing. When you begin to live from the true self, when you begin to make choices based on authentic desire rather than unconscious defense or the need for approval, your life begins to change in ways that feel simultaneously terrifying and deeply right. Relationships that were based on the false self may not survive this transition, because those relationships were predicated on you being who they needed you to be. And if you are no longer willing to perform that role, if you are no longer willing to abandon yourself for connection, the relationship will either deepen into something more authentic or it will end. This is painful. This is part of the initiation, because you are discovering that some connections were never really connections at all. They were transactions. You performed, they approved. You accommodated, they stayed. But love is not accommodation. Love is being seen and valued as you actually are. Career paths that made sense for the defended self may no longer make sense, because perhaps you chose that career to prove something, to earn approval, to meet some expectation you internalized long ago. But if you are no longer driven by the need to prove or perform, what do you actually want to do with your time and energy? This question can be destabilizing, because many people discover they have been so busy becoming who they thought they should be that they never stop to consider who they want to be. But this destabilization is not chaos, it is possibility. Jung had a term for this process: individuation. It means becoming who you actually are, as distinct from what your family, culture, or circumstances expected you to be. It means differentiating yourself from the collective, from the unconscious, from the defensive patterns, and discovering your unique path. Individuation is not selfishness, though it may be labeled as such by those who benefited from your full self. Individuation is the fulfillment of your particular potential, the expression of your specific gifts, the living out of your own truth rather than someone else's script. And here is what Jung understood. Individuation is not just a personal process, it is a collective necessity. Because a society full of people living from their false selves, full of people unconsciously acting out their wounds, full of people who have never met their authentic selves, is a sick society. It is a society that will perpetuate trauma across generations, that will project its shadow onto others, that will choose reactive comfort over genuine growth. But individuals who do the work of seeing their wounds, integrating their shadow, and living from their authentic selves become sources of healing, not just for themselves but for the collective. They break the cycle of intergenerational trauma. They model consciousness. They make it possible for others to do the same work. Your healing is not just personal. It is political. It is spiritual. It is evolutionary. Let us speak practically now about what this awakening looks like in daily life, because transformation is not just about mystical realizations or cathartic emotional releases. It is about making different choices, moment by moment, based on increasing awareness of your patterns. First, you begin to notice your defenses in real time. You catch yourself people-pleasing and recognize it as the old pattern of earning love through performance. You catch yourself withdrawing from intimacy and recognize it as the old pattern of avoiding abandonment. You catch yourself perfectionism driving yourself and recognize it as the old pattern of trying to prove your worth. The noticing itself is transformative, because you cannot change what you cannot see. And once you see your patterns, once you recognize them as patterns rather than as just who you are, you have created space between stimulus and response. You have created choice. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps, wrote, "Between stimulus and response there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. This is the gift of consciousness. Not that it makes the wounds disappear, not that it instantly dissolves the patterns, but that it creates space. And in that space you can begin to choose differently. You can choose to speak your truth, even though the old wound says it is dangerous. You can choose to set a boundary, even though the old pattern says accommodation is necessary for love. You can choose to ask for what you need, even though the old belief says your needs are a burden. These choices will feel uncomfortable at first. They will feel false or contrived because you are so used to the automatic pattern. Your nervous system will sound alarms because you are violating the old rules for staying safe. But if you can tolerate the discomfort, if you can stay present with the anxiety that arises, something remarkable happens. The world does not end. People do not all abandon you. You are not rejected or destroyed. And slowly, Experience by experience, you begin to update your core beliefs. You begin to collect evidence that contradicts the wound. You begin to build new neural pathways, new automatic responses, new ways of being in the world. Second, you begin to develop what psychologists call mentalization, the capacity to see yourself from the outside and others from the inside. To recognize that your internal experience is not the same as objective reality, that your feelings, while valid and important, are not always accurate reflections of what is actually happening. When you feel the surge of anxiety that someone is about to abandon you, you can pause and ask, is this about what is actually happening right now? Or is this my old wound being triggered? Is there actual evidence that this person is leaving? Or am I interpreting ambiguous signals through the lens of my childhood experience? This is not about dismissing your feelings. It is about contextualizing them, about understanding that feelings are information, but they are not always accurate information. Sometimes feelings are memories in disguise. Sometimes feelings are predictions based on past patterns rather than present reality. The capacity to mentalize allows you to hold your experience more lightly, with curiosity rather than certainty. It allows you to say, I notice I am feeling anxious, rather than something terrible is happening. It allows you to investigate rather than react. And this investigation often reveals that the present moment is not actually dangerous, even though your nervous system is responding as if it is. The present moment is just triggering something old, something unresolved, something that needs your attention and compassion rather than your reactivity. Third, you begin to reparent yourself. This is perhaps the most important work of all, because the truth is, no one is coming to save you. Your actual parents, even if they are still alive, cannot go back in time and give you what you needed as a child. And even if they apologized, even if they acknowledged their failures and took responsibility, it would not erase the neural patterns that were formed. It would not automatically heal the wound. The only person who can give you what you needed as a child is the adult you are now. You must become the parent to your wounded inner child that you needed and did not have. This sounds like pop psychology, like a cliché from a self-help book, but it is actually a profound and sophisticated psychological intervention supported by decades of research in attachment theory and neuroscience. When you are triggered, when you are in the grip of an old pattern, you are not actually in the present moment. You are in a kind of time collapse where the past and present are fused together. The adult part of you knows intellectually that you are safe now, but the child part of you is experiencing the situation as if the original danger is happening again. Reparenting involves the adult part of you consciously connecting with the child part of you and offering what that child needed: reassurance, validation, protection, permission to feel, permission to need. In practical terms, this might look like placing a hand on your heart when you are anxious and saying internally, I know you are scared. I am here with you. You are safe now. I will not abandon you. It might look like, when the inner critic attacks, consciously intervening and saying, that is not my voice. That is the voice of the wound. I do not have to listen to it. It might look like when you want to people please or accommodate to avoid rejection, pausing and asking the child part of you, what do you actually need right now? What do you want to say or do if you were not afraid? This internal dialogue is not weakness or indulgence, it is neuroscience. You are literally creating new neural pathways, offering your nervous system a different experience than the one it learned in childhood. You are showing your system that there is an adult present now who can provide safety, who can attune to needs, who will not abandon or reject or shame. Over time, with consistency, this reparenting becomes internalized. The secure attachment you create with yourself begins to change how you experience the world. The nervous system begins to relax. The defenses begin to soften. The authentic self emerges more reliably, and this brings us to perhaps the most radical realization of all. You are not broken. You have never been broken. Everything you have done, every pattern you have developed, every defense you have constructed, has been an intelligent response to circumstances that were genuinely difficult or overwhelming. You are not damaged. You are adapted. The problem is not that you adapted. The problem is that you are still adapting to circumstances that no longer exist. But adaptation is a sign of health, not pathology. It is evidence of your resilience, your creativity, your will to survive. The same psyche that created your defenses can also dismantle them. The same nervous system that learned danger can also learn safety. This reframing is crucial because so much of self-help culture pathologizes the wounded self. It treats your patterns as problems to be fixed, flaws to be overcome, weaknesses to be strengthened. And while there is nothing wrong with wanting to grow and change, this framing often reinforces the core wound of shame. Something is wrong with me, but nothing is wrong with you. You are doing exactly what your system was designed to do. Learn from experience and adapt accordingly. The issue is simply that your system learned lessons that were appropriate for one context but are not appropriate for your current context. You do not need to be fixed. You need to be updated. You need to give your system new information, new experiences, new evidence that allows it to recalibrate. And the most powerful new information you can give your system is this: I am here now. I am paying attention. I see you. I'm not going anywhere. You are safe to feel what you feel, to need what you need, to be who you are. Let me tell you about neuroplasticity, because this is the scientific foundation for all of the psychological and spiritual concepts we have been exploring. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change itself, to form new neural connections, to reorganize its structure and function in response to experience. For most of the 20th century, neuroscientists believed that the brain was relatively fixed after childhood, that the neural patterns formed early in life were essentially permanent. But research over the past few decades has shattered this assumption. We now know that the brain remains plastic throughout life. New neurons are created, new connections form. Existing connections can be strengthened or weakened based on use. The phrase in neuroscience is, neurons that fire together, wire together. This means that repeated patterns of neural activation create stronger connections, making those patterns more automatic, more likely to fire again in the future. This is how your childhood wounds became embedded in your neurobiology. The repeated experience of, say, reaching for connection and being rejected created a neural pattern. Reaching for connection equals danger. Over time, with repetition, this pattern became automatic, unconscious, your default response. But here is the liberating corollary. Neurons that fire apart, wire apart. Connections that are not used weaken over time. New patterns, with repetition, can become as automatic as the old ones. This means that healing is not just psychological or spiritual. It is biological. You are literally rewiring your brain every time you make a conscious choice that contradicts your old pattern. Every time you choose vulnerability instead of defense. Every time you choose authenticity instead of performance. Every time you choose presence instead of dissociation. At first, these new choices require enormous conscious effort. They feel unnatural, uncomfortable, even dangerous. Your old neural pathways are well-worn highways, and you are trying to create a new path through dense forest. Of course, it feels difficult, but with repetition, the new pathway becomes clearer, easier to navigate. The neurons begin to wire together in new configurations, and eventually, the new pattern can become as automatic as the old one was. This is not positive thinking. This is not affirmations or visualization or any form of magical thinking. This is neuroscience. You are changing the physical structure of your brain through experience. And the experiences that create the most powerful change are not just cognitive insights, they are embodied experiences. Moments when you feel something different in your body. Moments when you have a corrective emotional experience. When you expect rejection but receive acceptance. When you expect abandonment but experience someone staying. When you expect shame but receive compassion. These moments literally reshape your nervous system. They give your system new data to work with. They begin to dissolve the old belief structures, not through argument, but through evidence. There is a concept in Buddhism called dependent origination, the idea that all phenomena arise in dependence upon other phenomena. Nothing exists in isolation. Everything is interconnected, each thing both caused by and giving rise to other things. Your childhood wounds are part of a chain of dependent origination. They arose in dependence upon your early experiences. Those experiences arose in dependence upon your parents' own wounds, which arose in dependence upon their parents' wounds, stretching back through generations. Your patterns arise in dependence upon your wounds. Your relationships arise in dependence upon your patterns. Your children's development, if you have children, arises in dependence upon how conscious you are of your own patterns. This is both sobering and empowering. Sobering because it reveals the weight of intergenerational transmission of trauma. The wounds of your great-grandparents may still be playing out in your life, passed down through your grandparents and parents and now to you, unless someone in the chain becomes conscious enough to interrupt it. But empowering because it means that your work is not just personal. Every time you bring consciousness to your patterns, every time you choose differently, every time you offer your wounded child self the compassion and presence that was missing in your actual childhood, you are changing not just your own life, but potentially the lives of all the people you touch. You are breaking the chain. You are becoming the ancestor who heals rather than the ancestor who wounds. This is the ultimate meaning of awakening in the psychological sense, not transcendence, not escape from the human condition, but conscious participation in your own evolution and in the evolution of all the systems you are embedded in. And so we arrive at the revelation that changes everything. Your wounds are not obstacles to your growth. They are the path of your growth. The places where you are most defended are the places where your greatest gifts are hidden. The experiences you have most avoided feeling are the experiences that contain your deepest wisdom. The parts of yourself you have most rejected are the parts that hold your unique genius. Jung said, "Where you stumble, there lies your treasure." This is not metaphor. This is literal psychological truth. Your stumbling blocks are your treasure because they point to where your consciousness is still constrained, where you are still identified with the defended self rather than living from the authentic self. Every trigger is an opportunity. Every moment of reactivity is an invitation to look deeper. Every repetition of an old pattern is a chance to choose differently. This does not mean that healing is easy or that wounds are good. Suffering is still suffering. Pain is still pain. The child in you who was hurt deserved better, deserved to be protected and cherished and seen. But since the hurt has already happened, since the wound is already there, the question becomes, what will you do with it? Will you let it continue to run your life unconsciously? Or will you turn toward it, meet it, integrate it, and transform it into wisdom? The wound can become the gift, but only if you are willing to unwrap it. Only if you are willing to feel what you have been running from. Only if you are willing to see what you have been avoiding. This is the awakening, not the arrival at some permanent state of enlightenment or healing, but the moment-to-moment choice to stay conscious, to stay present, to keep choosing truth over defense, authenticity over performance, vulnerability over protection. And gradually, Imperceptibly at first, but then unmistakably, you notice that you are different. You respond differently to stress. You choose different kinds of relationships. You speak differently to yourself. You move through the world with less fear and more presence. You are becoming yourself. Not the self you constructed to survive, but the self you were always meant to be. Conclusion: the stirring of a new consciousness. We have traveled deep tonight, into the archaeology of the self, through the layers of identity, down to the bedrock of early experience where the foundations were laid. We have seen how the child you were shaped, the adult you became, how wounds became identity, how defenses became personality, how the survival strategies of a 5-year-old have been directing the choices of a 35-year-old or a 55-year-old. And we have seen the possibility of something else. The possibility of awakening from the trance of unconscious repetition. The possibility of meeting yourself, finally, as you actually are rather than as you were forced to become. But let us zoom out now. Let us place this personal journey in a larger context. Because what we have been discussing is not just individual psychology. It is the fundamental challenge facing human consciousness at this moment in history. We live in a world of wounded people, unconsciously acting out their traumas on a collective scale. Nations behave like traumatized individuals, oscillating between aggression and withdrawal, unable to regulate their responses, perceiving threat where there is possibility, repeating historical patterns compulsively. Our technologies amplify our patterns. Social media is designed to trigger the wound of rejection, to create endless cycles of seeking validation, to keep us in states of anxiety and comparison. Consumer culture is designed to trigger the wound of not enoughness, to promise that the next purchase will finally make us complete. Political discourse is designed to trigger the wound of tribalism, to divide us into us versus them, to keep us in perpetual states of fear and reactivity. And most people are navigating this landscape unconsciously, driven by wounds they have never examined, defended against pain they have never processed, seeking resolution for traumas they cannot name. This is not sustainable, not for individuals, not for societies, not for our species. We are at an evolutionary crossroads. The level of consciousness that created our current crises cannot solve those crises. We cannot think our way out of problems that are fundamentally rooted in unconscious emotional patterns. We cannot build a healthy society out of psychologically fragmented individuals. The work of healing your childhood wounds is not self-indulgent navel-gazing. It is evolutionary necessity. It is the most important work you can do, not just for yourself, but for everyone whose life you touch. Because consciousness is contagious. When you do the work of seeing your patterns, integrating your shadow, and living from your authentic self, you change the field around you. You model a different possibility. You break the chain of intergenerational trauma. You become a source of healing rather than a vector of wounding. The philosopher Ken Wilber speaks of the evolution of consciousness in stages, from egocentric consciousness, where the self is identified with its own immediate needs and desires, to ethnocentric consciousness, where the self is identified with its tribe, nation, or religion, to world-centric consciousness, where the self is identified with all of humanity, and potentially beyond that, to cosmocentric consciousness, where the self is identified with all of existence. But here is what Wilber and other developmental theorists understand. You cannot skip stages. You cannot transcend what you have not integrated. If you have not done the work of healing your egocentric wounds, your attempts at world-centric consciousness will be performances, spiritual bypasses, ways of avoiding your actual pain by adopting high-minded ideals. True evolution of consciousness requires going back before going forward, descending into the personal before ascending into the transpersonal, meeting the wounded child before becoming the awakened adult. This is why the psychological work is spiritual work, why therapy is a form of meditation, why healing your relationship with your mother is as important as understanding the nature of the cosmos, because you cannot transcend what you have not integrated. And integration requires meeting yourself at every level, including the levels that are painful, shameful, young, and scared. Let me speak now to those of you listening who recognize yourselves in what has been described tonight, who see your patterns reflected in these words, who feel the stirring of something long dormant beginning to awaken. First, know this: the fact that you can see your patterns is already transformation. Consciousness itself is healing. The moment you stop identifying as your defenses and start seeing your defenses as defenses, you have created the space for change. Do not underestimate this. Most people never reach this point. Most people live their entire lives unconsciously repeating their patterns, blaming others for the pain those patterns create, never recognizing that the source of their suffering is not external circumstances, but internal structure. If you can see it, you are already free of it in some fundamental way. Not completely, not permanently, but the prison door is open. Now you just have to walk through it again and again, each time you catch yourself falling back into the old pattern. Second, know that this work takes time. You did not develop your defenses overnight, and you will not dismantle them overnight. Healing is not linear. There will be progress and regression. Days when you feel like you have figured it all out, and days when you feel like you have learned nothing, like you are right back where you started. This is normal. This is the process. Do not let the setbacks convince you that healing is impossible. They are not setbacks. They are opportunities to practice bringing consciousness to the pattern one more time. Every time you catch yourself in the old pattern and choose differently, even if only for a moment, you are building new neural pathways. Every time you offer compassion to your wounded child self instead of judgment, you are creating secure attachment where there was once insecurity. Every time you speak your truth despite the fear, you are proving to your nervous system that it is safe to be authentic. The changes are happening at levels you cannot always perceive. Trust the process. Trust that every moment of consciousness matters, even when it feels like you are not making progress. Third, know that you do not have to do this alone. In fact, you cannot do it alone. The wounds were created in relationship, and they must be healed in relationship. This might mean therapy, working with someone who can help you see your blind spots, who can offer the attuned presence that was missing in your childhood. This might mean joining communities of others doing similar work, where you can practice vulnerability and receive acceptance. This might mean deepening your existing relationships by becoming more honest, more real, less defended. The relational wounds require relational healing. You need experiences of being seen, accepted, and valued as you actually are. You need to have your feelings witnessed and validated. You need to practice intimacy without abandoning yourself. These corrective emotional experiences are not luxuries. They are necessities. They are how you update your nervous system's fundamental assumptions about relationships. They are how you learn in your body and not just in your mind that it is possible to be authentic and still be loved. Find your people. Find your healers. Find your mirrors. You are not meant to do this alone. Fourth, be gentle with yourself. The inner critic will try to turn even this process of healing into another opportunity for self-judgment. It will tell you that you are doing it wrong, that you should be further along by now, that you are too damaged or too old or too stuck to change. This is the voice of the wound, not the voice of wisdom. Every human being who has ever done this work has struggled. Every person who seems whole and healed has their own scars, their own ongoing process. There is no finish line where you arrive at perfect mental health and never struggle again. The goal is not perfection. The goal is consciousness. The goal is to be in relationship with your patterns rather than unconsciously driven by them. The goal is to have choice where once you only had compulsion, and this is enough. This is everything. Let me tell you what becomes possible on the other side of this work. Not to promise easy answers or magical transformations, but to offer a vision of what awaits those who are willing to make the descent and do the work of integration. You discover that you have more capacity than you knew, more resilience, more creativity, more aliveness, because all the energy that was going into defense is now available for authentic living. All the intelligence that was devoted to maintaining your false self is now freed up to express your true self. You discover that relationships become richer, more nourishing, more real, because you are no longer performing for acceptance. You are offering your authentic self and allowing others to do the same. The people who cannot meet you there will naturally fall away, and the people who can will move closer. You discover that work becomes more meaningful, because you are choosing based on authentic values rather than unconscious compensation for wounds. You are not trying to prove anything anymore. You are simply expressing your unique gifts in whatever way feels true. You discover that creativity flows more easily, because creativity requires access to the unconscious, and you have done the work of making friends with your unconscious. The parts of yourself that were rejected and exiled often contain your deepest artistic and innovative impulses. You discover that you can hold pain without being destroyed by it, that you can feel grief, anger, fear, without needing to immediately escape into distraction or numbness. This capacity to be present with difficulty is the foundation of genuine peace. You discover that joy becomes more accessible, because joy is not the opposite of pain. Joy is what emerges when you are fully present, when you are not divided against yourself, when you are not constantly defending. Joy is your natural state, when you are not in resistance to what is. And perhaps most importantly, you discover that you are not alone. That beneath all the defenses, beneath all the wounds, beneath all the ways humans differ from each other, there is a common human experience, a shared vulnerability, a shared longing for love, for belonging, for meaning. This recognition of our shared humanity is the foundation of compassion, not just for others, but for yourself. You cannot truly have compassion for yourself while you still believe that you are uniquely damaged, uniquely flawed, uniquely wounded. But when you see that everyone carries wounds, that everyone developed defenses, that everyone struggles with the gap between their authentic self and their adapted self, then you can hold yourself with the same gentleness you would offer anyone else on this difficult journey of being human. So let me return to the question we began with. Who are you really? You are not your wounds, but you are not separate from them either. They are part of your story, part of what has shaped you, part of what gives you depth and empathy and wisdom. You are not your defenses, but you are not required to judge them or reject them. They served you when you needed them. They kept you alive. You can thank them for their service and gently set them aside when they are no longer needed. You are not the voice of your inner critic. That voice is not your voice. It is an echo of others' judgments, internalized in childhood, now running on autopilot. You can learn to distinguish between the critic and your authentic inner knowing. You are not your patterns, but your patterns reveal where you are still unconscious, where you are still defending, where you still need to bring more awareness and compassion. So who are you? You are awareness itself, consciousness looking at itself. The capacity to witness your own experience, to see your patterns, to choose differently. You are the space in which all of your experiences arise. The wounds, the defenses, the patterns, the authentic impulses, the defensive reactions. You are not the content of consciousness. You are consciousness itself. And this changes everything. Because if you are consciousness rather than the contents of consciousness, then you are not damaged by your wounds. You are not limited by your patterns. You are not imprisoned by your history. You are the awareness that can observe all of this, hold all of this, and gradually, patiently, compassionately transform all of this. This is the awakening, not a single moment of realization, but a gradual shift in identification. From being the wounded self to being the awareness that holds the wounded self. From being the defended self to being the presence that witnesses the defenses arising and dissolving. You are not becoming someone new. You are remembering who you have always been beneath the layers of conditioning and wounding and adaptation. You are coming home to yourself. And so, traveler, we come to the end of this first episode of our journey together, but really, we are just beginning. This is episode 1, How Childhood Wounds Become Adult Identities. The stirring has begun. The awakening has been initiated. In the episodes to come, we will explore many related territories: the technology of thought, the evolution of consciousness, the relationship between mind and reality, the future of human potential. But all of it will build on this foundation we have laid tonight. The understanding that consciousness is the key to transformation, that seeing is the beginning of freedom, that the wounds of the past do not have to determine the trajectory of the future. You are not trapped in your history. You are not imprisoned by your conditioning. You are not doomed to repeat your patterns forever. You are consciousness, temporarily identified with a particular set of experiences and patterns, capable of waking up to your true nature at any moment, and that moment can be now. So I leave you tonight with a question, not to be answered quickly, but to be lived into, to be sat with, to be allowed to work on you in the days and weeks ahead. If you were not defending against your childhood wounds, if you were not performing for acceptance or avoiding rejection, if you were not trying to prove your worth or protect yourself from pain, who would you be? What would you want? How would you love? What would you create? Who is the person underneath the armor? This is the question that calls you forward. This is the question that will not let you rest until you answer it with your life. The stirring has begun. The ancient echoes are calling you home. The journey into consciousness awaits. Welcome, traveler, to the beginning of awakening. Welcome to yourself. If this exploration has stirred something in you, if you recognize yourself in these patterns, if you feel the call to go deeper, then I invite you to join me for the next episode. Subscribe, stay connected, and most importantly, begin the work in your own life. Notice your patterns, question your defenses, meet your wounded child with compassion, choose consciousness over automation. The evolution of human consciousness begins with individuals willing to do this work. It begins with you. Until next time, may you walk gently with yourself. May you bring light to the darkness within. May you remember who you have always been beneath the wounds. This is Echoes of the Ancients, and this has been episode 1 of season 1, The Stirring. The ancient wisdom is alive in you. Listen.